Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're tackling a massive question. What could possibly drive the world's most powerful nations into a conflict so utterly devastating that it would be known as the Great War?
Okay, so let's dive right into the central mystery here. How on earth does the assassination of a single person in Sarajevo set off a chain reaction that engulfs the entire globe in war? That's the puzzle we're going to unpack.
Well, the thing is, the First World War didn't just happen because of one event. It's much better to think of it like a giant pressure cooker. For decades, this really volatile mix of dangerous ingredients had been simmering all across Europe, just waiting for a spark to cause a massive, massive explosion.
And to get a handle on this recipe for disaster, historians have this really handy acronym to help us make sense of it all: MAIN. It stands for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. These are the four huge forces that basically made the catastrophe almost inevitable, and they're going to be our guide.
So let's start with the first ingredient, M for militarism. And you gotta understand, this was way more than just having a big army. It was a whole cultural mindset, this deep-seated belief that a nation's true greatness was measured by the strength of its military.
And this creates this really dangerous, kind of ironic situation called the security dilemma. It's this vicious cycle, right? One country builds up its army saying, hey, it's just for defense, but of course its neighbors look at that and see a threat, so they start building up their armies. And the result? Everybody's got more guns, but somehow everybody feels less secure than they did before.
And then you have the Industrial Revolution pouring gasoline all over this fire. Suddenly, factories could churn out weapons on a scale that was just mind-boggling. We're talking machine guns that could fire hundreds of rounds a minute, artillery that could flatten towns. This new tech didn't just speed up the arms race, it meant the potential for casualties was just off the charts.
Now, right at the center of this whole arms race was the newly unified Germany. Because it only became a country in 1871, it was kind of the new kid on the block, and it was desperate to catch up. Its industrial power was exploding, and it used that to build this enormous army. For the old guard, Britain and France, this wasn't just friendly competition. It felt like a direct threat, and it just bred this deep, deep mistrust across the continent.
So okay, you've got all this suspicion, all these weapons, and that leads us right to the next piece of the puzzle. A for alliances. To deal with this growing feeling of insecurity, nations started making these pacts, these deals that were supposed to keep the peace. But instead, they created what was essentially a continent-wide tripwire for war.
By the time we get to the early 1900s, Europe is basically split into two big armed camps. It's like a schoolyard standoff, but with empires. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance. That's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And on the other, you had the Triple Entente, which linked up Britain, France, and Russia. And the basic rule for both these teams was simple. You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. In theory, this was about collective security. But in reality, it meant a little squabble in some corner of Europe could suddenly become everybody's problem, a full-blown continental war.
And this system created this incredibly hidden danger, the mobilization trap. See, every major country had these super detailed, super rigid plans to move millions of soldiers to the front lines using their railway systems. The moment a leader said go, these incredibly complex timetables, they just clicked into motion. It was all automatic. Trying to stop or reverse it would cause absolute chaos and leave your country totally vulnerable. It was literally like a runaway train with no brakes.
All right, so for our last big ingredients, we've got these two powerful forces that were all tangled up together, I for imperialism and N for nationalism. And these weren't just political ideas, they were feelings, emotions that convinced millions of people that war wasn't something to be feared, but something glorious.
First up, imperialism. The big European powers were in this fierce competition, the scramble for empire. Having colonies all over Africa and Asia wasn't just about money and resources, it was like the ultimate flex, a sign of your nation's power. And once again, Germany, being late to the game, felt like it wasn't getting its fair share, its so-called place in the sun. Its aggressive push to grab colonies created direct tension with the big established empires of Britain and France.
And running right alongside this was nationalism. And this went way beyond just loving your country. This was an intense, almost fanatical belief that your nation, your culture, your people were superior to everyone else's. It fostered this incredibly strong us versus them mentality, where every other country was seen as a rival, or worse, an enemy.
And this whole belief system, which was pushed hard in schools, in the newspapers, through all kinds of propaganda, made the idea of sitting down and talking, finding a compromise, look like being weak. If you're totally convinced that your nation is always right and is always under threat, you're going to reach for a weapon, not an olive branch.
So let's recap. You've got militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism all simmering in this one giant pot. The whole of Europe was a powder keg, just filled to the brim, and all it needed was one single spark to set the whole thing off.
And this is absolutely the key takeaway here. The assassination in Sarajevo was the match, not the powder keg. It was the MAINN forces we've been talking about that did all the real work, creating a situation that was just begging to blow up. And man, when it happened fast. Just look at this timeline. June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is killed. Exactly 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. And then, boom. Within a single week, Russia, Germany, France, and Britain are all at war. The whole system just snapped.
See, Austria-Hungary, with Germany's full support, gave Serbia this list of demands that was basically impossible to accept. And when Serbia couldn't meet every single one, the dominoes started to fall. Russia began to mobilize to protect its ally, Serbia. That triggered Germany to mobilize to support Austria-Hungary. And remember those rigid, unstoppable mobilization plans? Yep, they kicked into gear, and suddenly everyone was on the move.
Look, figuring out how this all happened isn't just about dusty history books. It's a pretty stark warning, right? And it really makes you ask a tough question about our own time.
The world of 1914 is obviously long gone. But those powerful forces, nationalism, complex alliances, rivalries between great powers, they're still very much with us. So you have to ask yourself, what are our modern-day railroad timetables? What are the systems we've built today, maybe technological, maybe political, that could lock us into a course of action and make it almost impossible to de-escalate in a crisis?